So this session is based on CBRS. And for anyone who was at MWC this year, you'll know private networks was a big topic, but CBRS was particularly good as well. And we at MWC split the insights down into two buckets from MWC, really. The first one was much more focused on the telecoms operator, thinking about private networks and slicing from the more technical standpoint. The second side was how are vendors and service providers and solution vendors and software vendors thinking about driving private networks forward through CBRS by enabling the systems integrators and leveraging this new spectrum model in the US as a way to drive scale in private networks. So hopefully this session is really aimed at trying to understand a little bit more about that model, about the spectrum licensing, and work out, what does that really mean for the industry? How does this really shift up the ecosystem around private networks? So I'm Darius. I'm one of the consulting directors at STL, and I lead private networks with one of my colleagues, Yasmin. And I'm joined by my colleague Ahmed, who's one of the senior analysts at STL, and he's been covering a lot on private networks with us, trying to help elucidate, I suppose, the ecosystem and how things like CBRS really drive change. So I don't know, Ahmed, if you want to do a quick intro to yourself as well.
As Darius said, I'm one of the senior analysts here at STL. I've been covering different topics, including private networks and edge computing and telco cloud, and they're all kind of related, but more and more my focus is becoming private networks as it continues to develop as a new market, and there are lots of interesting stuff happening there, and CBRS is obviously one of them, as a kind of a unique market on its own and with its own characteristic and ecosystem. So I guess it might be worth just to give a quick overview of what CBRS is, if one of the listeners.
Yeah, well, I think that was the first thing we wanted to dive into, was just, we wrote this article around CBRS and the role there, but it might be worth just up front, when we say CBRS, what are we really talking about, and what does it mean? What are the different models?
Sure. So mainly, I guess CBRS is it refers to the spectrum or the band and the system that the US has allocated for enterprises to deploy their wireless systems. So in a way, it's equivalent to other enterprise licensing schemes in other countries. But it's also quite unique because it's a shared spectrum and it's a tiered system. So there is the top tier or the high priority users of the spectrum, which are the incumbents, and in this case, it's mostly the U.S. Navy, and these have the absolute right to use the spectrum whenever they access it. The other two tiers are the ones that are allocated to enterprise, and they can use it in two different ways. One is to acquire a license. So this is the priority access tier. And there has been an auction, I guess about 2 years ago, where lots of licenses have been acquired by the major players. And the remaining of the spectrum, or actually a big part of it, is an unlicensed portion, and it's called the general authorized access. So that's completely unlicensed. Anyone can deploy their private network or actually use the spectrum in any way they'd like to. And to kind of coordinate between these different users, there's also a third or a fourth element, which is the spectrum access system, SAS. It's usually a software provider that provides some kind of a tool that enables that monitors the spectrum and allows the user to access it when the higher priority players are not there. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. I guess there's also lots of similarities to other and systems in other countries, but also lots of differences as well.
Yeah, no, because I was going to ask, because CBRS is quite unique to the US, right? But there are other markets doing other kind of models with spectrum and trying to shift up from just traditional MNO spectrum and think about other models. So how does CBRS compare to some of those other countries? And I don't know if you have any examples from those countries of, where markets are doing something a bit more innovative around spectrum.
Yeah, so I think the leading markets, or the markets that have been talked about a lot, are Germany, the UK, Japan. I think France is also doing a lot of local licensing. There are also other countries that are starting to free up some of their spectrum for enterprises. Like I think India is in the process. So lots of countries are have either freed up some spectrum for enterprise or in the process of doing so and considering which model to go for. However, I think CBRS is quite unique because one, it has a unlicensed portion to it. So that in a way removes kind of a barrier for many enterprises in terms of the cost of acquiring spectrum, but also the process of applying for a spectrum. But it also comes with some disadvantages because as any unlicensed spectrum, it's shared and there might be some concerns over interference and security. But also it's different even in the license portion. So most of the other countries, an enterprise can just apply for a license. So it's a process initiated by the enterprise, and you have to specify the use case and all of that. While for CBRS, it was auctioned. And because of that, I guess that was one of the limitation for many enterprises to go through the auction and acquire in advance. Also, the range of the license is not really suitable for many enterprises. So it's a county wide kind of coverage. So most of the enterprises or use cases require much smaller coverage than that. So it might not justify the cost for these enterprises. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask, so how is CBRS being used or deployed at the moment then, if it does have some drawbacks in terms of coverage across a wide area, possibly in terms of interference from others that are using the unlicensed spectrum? Is there almost a split between what use cases or what verticals look at licensed spectrum models versus those that maybe might leverage CBRS?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting how the market has developed because of the split between the licensed and the unlicensed. I think when the auction happened, most of the acquirers were like the big players like telcos and cable providers and wireless internet providers as well. So for these, the drivers were to provide some kind of support for the mobile broadband, but also deploy some fixed wireless access as a backhaul. And it seems like because of that, the rural deployments are leading or kind of driving the market, and that has been very beneficial for some sectors like schools, for example. So there have been lots of school districts in remote locations where the perhaps low cost and ease of access for CBRS has made it possible for them to support to deploy some kind of communication system. and especially when the pandemic happened and with remote learning, that was very helpful.
Mm,
Utilities as well have been using lots of CBRS. Um, but for the enterprises themselves, I think the majority of deployments for private networks is still happening in the unlicensed portion.
mm,
And that has also led to the development of the solutions in a certain way. So we see the hyperscalers moving into the market to kind of provide private network as a service type model. So it's a lot of I think when you remove the spectrum allocation or the spectrum acquisition part of the equation, and you can repackage the entire solution as a service. First, it can be sold easier through a system integrator
mhm,
where they can add their services on top of that. So it helped in driving that market. And in terms of the users themselves, the customers themselves, there seem to be a driver, or the market is targeting the mid-size or the smaller and mid-sized type of players, like in education and healthcare and retail, where they can just use this as a service type of model and start deploying
mm,
private networks. So lots of positive things are happening, but I guess also there's a lot of debate whether this shared model should be extended into other type of spectrum, or it's still underutilized, and we still need to
mm,
try and work with what we have at the moment. And there are
mm,
like two sides of the market trying to kind of lobby for
mhm.
each solution.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I thought it was interesting what you mentioned as well about enabling the SI to come and sell their own services on top. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, MWC, it really did feel like there was a set of vendors and telcos making noise around private networks for the license side, and then quite a large number of maybe the smaller players making noise around CBRS in the US and how they were going to enable the SI to go direct to market and kind of navigate around the telecoms operator. So it is interesting. And I don't know if you feel like those dynamics really will continue, or whether this is just speculation at the moment, or even how, CBRS might enable hyperscalers to come in more effectively and play in that private network space as well.
I think the general um, kind of goal, or what everyone wants to happen, is for private networks, whether it's CBRS or any other band, is to move into towards a model that's very simplified, where the customer can do some of the deployment or the planning or the acquisition of the equipment by themselves. So in one side, it lowers the cost. It requires less expertise, and it helps the adoption. In reality, that's probably not going to happen in so many sectors where you would need some kind of support from the system integrators to plan the RF and to maintain the network, to manage the network.
Hmm.
So I guess the easier the solution um, develop into, the more um, system integrated types of players move into the market and try
Hmm.
and make use of that model.
Sure. No, perfect. That makes sense. And look, we want to make sure we get some questions from those who are listening as well. So if you do have any questions for either myself or Ahmed on CBRS or the work we're doing in private networks, do drop them in the chat and I should hopefully be able to see them. And what we'll do is after this, we'll send a recording kind of this conversation. So you have it for those who've registered. We'll also send a link to the article that Ahmed wrote, diving into some of these topics and kind of laying it out a little clearly online so that you can read it and see, well, okay, what does CBRS really mean? A little bit more about those different bands within CBRS and how different users can access them. Yeah, as we said at the beginning, we're doing quite a lot of work in the private network space, and through these LinkedIn Lives, we want to continue to share some of what we're learning from research and from consulting on a range of different topics within private networks. So this one, as we said, was on CBRS. The one that we did last time was on the interplay between network slicing and dedicated campus or private networks. And the one before that, we looked at different buying journeys for the customers. How do they think about procuring private networks? So if you are interested in understanding more about what we're doing in private networks and how we can possibly support, do get in touch with either myself, with Ahmed, with General STL. And we've got a few questions coming through now as well. One was looking a little bit more about CBRS performance wise and thinking about that with regards to jitter. So of course, when we look at private networks, one of the major drivers is not just low latency, but reliability of latency and jitter. Has that come up as something in our conversations around CBRS and whether CBRS can tackle jitter and reliability as a metric, or is that one where maybe it has a slight disadvantage versus licensed spectrum?
I think so. It's quite interesting that the majority of the deployments at the moment seem to be in rural areas. So I think the NTIA, which is the organization that govern the spectrum allocation between the different types of users, recently published a report that says that 70% of the deployments seem to be in rural areas. And I think perhaps the interference issue is interference is less of an issue compared to highly dense urban areas. And the question of whether to use licensed and unlicensed is not like a major issue in these locations. But I guess, yeah, when you move into cities and highly dense areas, I believe it will be probably an issue, and you will need to kind of use some kind of a spectrum, licensed spectrum as an anchor. So that's I guess the model of leasing part of the licensed spectrum. You can still use the unlicensed spectrum for the majority of the use case, but you'll have an anchor from the license. So combining these to kind of add some reliability to the network.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And we've got another question here from Mike on will per device pricing end in private networks? So I guess the notion of charging for the network based on SIM and then data usage within the SIM. So not necessarily tied to CBRS. I guess that's a wider question. And I guess one of my perspectives is that might have to change when we think about IoT, right? And if you have a port that's deploying thousands of sensors, does a per device charging model make sense, or do you have a slightly different notion? And I don't know from your perspective if CBRS changes that different model, but yeah, any thoughts on per device pricing for private networking?
I think so. Looking at the private network as a service model, when you look at different pricing from hyperscalers, I think some of them are not really charging per device, which makes sense because I think typically hyperscalers would love to have more data going through their clouds or systems, and I think that's perhaps more in like perhaps more lucrative model for large deployments. But I guess there will be obviously different type of models and with more solutions and with more players dedicated to different use cases or different sectors.
Yeah, and from my perspective, fundamentally the charging model, the pricing model for private networks, that I think needs to change to be able to scale beyond, the major Fortune 500 companies that might pay $1 million capex, 2 million capex in the first year to deploy a private network. And I think telecoms operators probably do go in with this notion of, I need to monetize the network. But from the enterprise perspective, they don't really care about private 5G or Wi-Fi or whatever. They just want a solution that works. So you need to be able to sell a business outcome. And
Yeah.
do you sell a business outcome on a per device level, or do you sell it in a different way? And you mentioned the hyperscalers not charging per device and AWS's direct service. Do they really want to monetize the network, or are they going to monetize the data that then pulls through the network and is leveraged on their cloud, right? They're going to want to drive core cloud revenues. Are they going to actually think about how they're selling a private network? So I think the model does need to change, and telecoms operators to scale need to think quite closely about how they do develop that pricing model. So we had a question from Larry around the connection, I guess, between neutral hosts and CBRS. I don't know if we've seen much of the neutral host market within private networks in the context of private networks being leveraging CBRS as a spectrum model, or whether that's a route that the vendors could take in this way to start to get maybe more of that rural coverage without needing to build and provision their own infrastructure.
I think it does make sense. There is, I think especially for telcos, like they would want to sell some kind of a neutral host. I mean, for enterprises, if you want to, especially the ones that with commercial kind of operations like retail or stadiums or stuff like that, neutral host make a lot more sense to deploy rather than sticking to like a single kind of network. I'm not sure if I followed the development of neutral host within CBRS, but it's I guess.
Yeah, because I haven't heard much about people talking about that model, which maybe I haven't been looking for it. But yeah, when we've seen people talking about leveraging CBRS, it does tend, as Ahmed said, to be more about scaling into the mid-market of adopters. And I think Ericsson, for example, with their private networks, they have the Ericsson kind of industrial private network, and then through NetCloud and Cradlepoint. Thank you. And Cradlepoint, they have the CBRS one. And from my perspective, it's not a neutral host versus not. It's more these applications are much more mission critical, much more stringent requirements. We leverage a dedicated licensed spectrum private network. These ones have slightly different requirements. Maybe there's less interference as an issue because it's rural, or they don't have the cost base and to manage a licensed spectrum model, so they leverage CBRS. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I haven't seen much around neutral host activity on CBRS yet, but it could make sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So we just have one question from David as well on the European initiatives from Germany and France and how similar they are, which I know we touched on a little bit, but then also, I guess, what are they called? What do we call them? And from my perspective, the Germany one is industrial spectrum, it's called, right? But yeah, I don't know how similar, again, if you could cover how similar they are to the CBRS model.
I think the individual kind of countries initiatives, they are similar in a way that it's a spectrum that's been allocated for enterprises. The process of acquiring the spectrum is different, and the spectrum range is different. But I guess the thing with Europe is now they're trying to harmonize these different models. I guess that's the difference between the US and Europe, that across the entire US you have a harmonized kind of band, while in Europe every country has its own system. But I believe that's what the initiative is doing, is trying to bring all these countries into a harmonized spectrum band, which would help the entire kind of deployment across the region. Because I guess there is no point of having this kind of um, differences between countries. If an enterprise wants to deploy a use case in different regions, it will make it a very kind of
Hmm.
difficult process to change the solution for every individual country. So I guess there are more calls into bringing some kind of harmonized spectrum band and process across these countries.
Hmm. And the last question from Daniel, and I know you touched on this a little bit in the beginning when you were talking about the different bands, but he was asking the kind of SAS band, is availability the critical point as to whether that can be used in the industrial space? Is that availability of that spectrum band within CBRS why customers are hesitant, or are there other reasons that may make customers in the industrial more hesitant to adopt CBRS?
Um, that's, I guess, I'm not sure if customers are hesitant. Perhaps I think the unlicensed spectrum is something that might worry customers,
Mm,
assuming that there are no other competing um, deployments within the same region. It wouldn't be a major issue. Like that's why I guess the deployments in rural areas seem to be successful. There aren't many users competing for that spectrum. But again, for a manufacturing site in perhaps in not so remote or not so rural area where there are so many elements and users that might interfere with the spectrum, and deploying the entire network on an unlicensed spectrum might be something that a customer might not be willing to do, or they might have some concerns, and that's why I guess even with the private networks as a service type of model where you just apply for the solution and you get it delivered to you, it's not as easy as that. You'll still have the system integrators come in and um, the site survey and the radio planning and all of that to work around these issues.
mhm. Perfect. Look, well, thanks a lot, Ahmed, for joining us on another STL LinkedIn Live.